So yes, my name is Jan, and I'm a woman in long-term recovery, which means I haven't had a drink or a drug for 35 years. And thank you. And recovery allows me to do all of these things, right? So highlighting some, this year I was inducted, if you will, into the Hall of Fame for African Americans. So I'm in a museum, an online museum. I got to offer the prayer at the White House a few years back. I got married during COVID to the love of my life. I was on the front cover of the Daily Press. Above the fold, I hear, is a really cool thing. I got to do something with former President Bill Clinton. So recovery is amazing and allows you, one of my favorite too, I got to do a talk for Sesame Street, right? So I got to do that during COVID, which was a really neat thing as well. Most importantly these days, this I got to do 11 weeks ago, right? This is my little guy. And so you never know what recovery can happen. One of my favorite slides from the Recovery Research Institute is the one that shows that trajectory, because I get to keep going. Now, they haven't gone past 40 years, so we'll see what happens, but maybe my trajectory, because it just, as you saw, it just kept getting better. So that is really awesome. And so that's my new better, as I have this little guy that I'm doing my best, and he's amazing. He was born substance exposed. One of the things that I had always wondered about is about pre-birth trauma and what happens. And so God, who has a sense of humor, gave me a little child who had pre-birth trauma, and now we're getting to discover what's going to happen. I want to say thank you to the Rams in Recovery, particularly those who are sitting out at the desk, for what you all are doing and who you are. I am an alumnus of VCU, and so it's really exciting to get to know a lot of you. Tom has had me do several talks, and getting to spend time with you is a really cool thing. Also to the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services, I saw Alethea, who works in the Office of Recovery Services. I'm sure there are others of you, and thank you for what you're doing. And a special thanks to Tom. Tom, you are an amazing human being, and I'm glad to call you my friend as well as my colleague. So I'm really thankful for Corey, because she gave you all the research base to the recovery and recovery support, some of which I'm going to talk about, some of which I'm going to go through fast, because she just did it for me. But part of where we are is that recovery has many different definitions, right? So we've got definitions that are similar. We've got definitions that are very different. All of them are broader than abstinence or remission. So according to SAMHSA, many of us are familiar with this because we use this definition often in state work that people are doing at CHBs and CBHs, ours is Colonial Behavioral Health, CSBs and other places like that. And it really highlights that process of change, highlights health and wellness, self-directed, and the opportunity to reach our full potential. Betty Ford talks about the fact that it's voluntary. And these are the characterizations: personal health, citizenship, sobriety, meaning and purpose, meaning and purpose. You'll read them all over and over. CCAR, Connecticut Community of Addiction Recovery. People are in recovery if they say they are, right? One of the things that was highlighted in our last talk, and that I will highlight as well, is the individual nature of how people define recovery. Recovery Research Institute, process of improved physical, psychological, social well-being after having suffered from a substance use disorder. And if you look in different places on their website, they also talk about this thing called a substance-related problem. And I'm really hoping that we're moving more and more to that language, because I no longer meet diagnostic criteria for a substance use disorder. Right? It's been a long time since I've met that. I still have substance-related problems, right? And Corey highlighted some of those problems. I couldn't get health insurance. I couldn't get a loan, because on the form it says, have you ever been to treatment for alcohol use disorder? And the answer was yes, because I tell the truth these days. 25 years into my recovery, I could not get health insurance. So yeah, it's a substance-related problem. It's no longer meets diagnostic criteria for substance use disorder. And we'll go into that a little bit more as I keep talking. ASAM has an amazing definition, and I'm really glad you guys are going to get the slides because that's a whole lot of words. But suffice it to say, improved quality of life, enhanced wellness as defined by the individual. Individual, you'll see in the next one. Relief of an individual's symptoms, improvement of individuals' behavioral control and self-regulation. That is part of the solution, but it is also part of the problem, because how do researchers measure all of this individual nature when we see it very different, right? So one of the things that we get to do is offer researchers who are doing recovery research on our behalf an opportunity to find, well, what is common in all of these definitions, and what can they actually then study and produce outcomes that we can then leverage and do something with. Does that make sense? Okay. So the other piece is that it's different in different cultures and communities. Europeans tend to define it more in individual terms. People, Latinx, Native Americans, it's much more defined as part of family. I do work on the Navajo reservation, and one of the things that they say is that the family is the problem and the family is the solution, right? And so if we're not incorporating everyone, then we're not going to get very far. We also know from the Navajo Nation is that women are in charge, right? So it's a matrilineal culture. And so we also have to pay special attention to the women, because if you help the women, then you're going to help the rest of the family. And so there it's very, very different. You know, we also look at, and we're going to talk more deeply about looking at religions, spirituality. All of these different things are part of people's recovery, which can make it very difficult. Another piece that we talk about is abstinence and remission are usually the outcomes, and there's more, right? I haven't had a drink or a drug in a really long time. God willing, I won't have one anytime soon or for the rest of my life. And so there's a lot more to it than just whether you're using or you're not using. If that were the prize, I can tell you I wouldn't be where I am today. So one of the pieces that is often used, and we heard it just a few minutes ago, this idea of, did you once have a problem with drugs or alcohol but no longer do? Some of the science shows 25 million people are in recovery. Others of the science, I was looking at it the other night, show that 27.5 million people would answer that question in that way, that they had a substance use problem and they no longer do. That's a lot of people. And then among those who say they have had a substance use related problem and now do not, 20.5 million people would identify that they do, which is essentially 75%. So everyone in recovery, everyone who has resolved a problem with substance use disorder does not identify in recovery. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. So what does this mean for us? It means that we have to stretch our understanding when we say this thing called recovery. We need to become multilingual, is what I say. We need to go into other cultures and learn how they define recovery, not just the way I define recovery, using better words. We need to do a better job putting a face and voice on recovery, right? If there's 20 million of us, where are we? Where are we when we're trying to do some of this structural work that was highlighted earlier, community-based work? 20 million people is a whole lot of folks. So the piece is, one of the things that I really want to address is that we need to become a constituency of influence and power, right? Recovery has transformed my life, and for many of you that I know who are sitting out here, and some I know who are on Zoom, it doesn't look like or feel like anything. Recovery is beyond our wildest dreams, right? And for some people, recovery is possible. For some people, recovery is real, but there's a group of people for whom recovery is the expectation. And that's what we have to hold up as the benchmark or the standard for this thing called recovery, right? That everyone deserves evidence-based care for this thing called substance-related issues or addiction or substance use disorder. And we have to demand that instead of demanding, one of those things they talk about, what is it? Reach for the stars, because you might land somewhere that's still pretty good, right? But if we're reaching for non-evidence-based services, what's underneath that? I would suggest it's the criminal justice system, right? So we have to elevate and say we demand evidence-based services and supports for people who have substance-related problems. And then if we don't get all the way up there, we're still pretty high, right? But we're not in the criminal justice system and we're not dying, for Pete's sake. So everyone must be at the table. And I'm going to show this, I hope.
Thank you for calling Shoes. How may I be of assistance?
Hi, I ordered a pair of dress shoes for my son, and he was sent the wrong size.
I'm not sure I understand.
The shoes you sent just don't fit.
Did you try putting them on?
Yeah, we've been trying all morning. It's just not working.
Well, other people have been able to make that size work without a problem.
I don't know what we're doing wrong. They just seem way too big.
To be frank, in my experience, if your son really wanted the shoes, he would put them on and wear them until they fit.
No, he really wants these ones, but these won't even stay on his feet.
Ma'am, I'm sorry to hear that you and your son are unable to commit to making these shoes work, but we're confident we've given you the best option available.
This makes no sense to me.
Well, I can give you the number of another shoe company, but they'll tell you the same thing. Unless he can accept our shoe size, we can't help. And honestly, it seems like you're way over-involved in this. You need to stop cutting him so much slack. Let him know that if he doesn't want those shoes, he can just go barefoot.
He really needs help. His using is just out of control, and I'm afraid that something really bad might happen. But I just don't think that he's going to agree to go for 30 days. I just don't see that happening.
Well, taking the full 30 days is really important. Other people have been able to take the time needed without a problem. If it was important to him to get sober, he would be able to make this a priority.
I really want to help him with this. I mean, he says that it's really important for him to be someplace that also can work with his PTSD. I don't know if that's the best thing to do, but that's what he says would be really helpful.
I'm sorry to say this, but addicts come up with all kinds of excuses to avoid actually getting help. I'm not so sure that it's as much about PTSD as it is a case of terminal uniqueness.
I don't really think that's what's going on. I mean, I don't know, but I don't think that that's the case. I just think that he's scared, and I just don't know what we're doing wrong.
You called us because we're the experts, and frankly, I want to give you some direct feedback because we see this all the time. You're clearly way over-involved here, and codependency is part of this for you. I think you need to take a step back and realize that your son could die if you don't get him into rehab. You have to stop giving him so many options. Tell him he can go to rehab, or you're kicking him out of the house.
A shoe company telling us to just make it fit would be ridiculous. But many families have experienced this exact scenario, only with much higher stakes. Families are trying to help using their deep understanding of the situation, but are being repeatedly told to just make it fit. This one-size-fits-all approach is demeaning and harmful, and being treated this way can be discouraging and heartbreaking. We all deserve to be seen and heard when we're seeking help.
So that is a film that's not quite ready for prime time, but we're working on it. And we're working on expanding it. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the piece of recovery that we're adding to it. So here we have the recovery support specialist, right? Saying, how many meetings are you going to? And the recovery E, or the person who's receiving service, saying, none, I don't go to meetings. I don't like all that God talk. The specialist says, what do you mean you don't go to meetings? How do you stay clean without going to meetings? After all, meeting makers make it. The recovery says, I'm practicing moderation, so I'm not welcome in meetings because I don't have a desire to stop drinking or using or become abstinent. Specialist, what does your sponsor think about all of this? You've got a sponsor, right? Sponsorship isn't for me. I'm not going to tell someone who's done all the things I've done so that they can tell people and judge me. Why would I do that? Specialist, you must not have hit bottom because if you had, you'd be willing to go to any length to get it. That means doing a 90, going to meetings, getting a sponsor, doing step work. You're just not ready. You don't want it bad enough to do the work. That's still happening. And some of us, I know there was a time when I said the same thing. And sometimes I might not say it, but because of my own personal lived experience, sometimes I get over-involved in what people are doing for their personal recovery. And so one of the things that we have to remember is that for some, it's about those who describe individuals and their personal experience, and then also recovery is looked at as a set of recovery values and beliefs, and both of those have been talked about. So this is an opportunity for you to assess your own bias and comfort level, right? So when you think of recovery, we talk about the scope of recovery. And are you in your system, as an individual, in your research, whatever it is that you're doing, are you looking at it as a primary illness, or holistic, or are you looking at the primary and secondary? So that focuses on not only addiction health, but global health, right? So sometimes we overemphasize somebody's relationship and we don't look at some of the other things, or we make them secondary. An example of that is, I'm not going to treat you until you stop drinking and I'm not going to give you a new liver, right? I'm not going to give somebody who's in early recovery, who shows up at the doctor's office, they don't get a new liver because we have to prove to somebody that we're not going to use again in order to get that new liver. That's when we're focusing primary. Types of recovery. This is a big one for the recovery community, right? Is it abstinence-based recovery? Is it moderation-based recovery? Is it medication-assisted recovery? Are we also, going back to the bigger piece, are we looking at some of the behaviors that go along with it, right? So recovery is all about, as we've all agreed upon, or at least I'm assuming you agree with me, it's about changing our relationship with alcohol and drugs. For some, that means abstinence. For some, that means moderation. For some, that means medication. And changing our behaviors around lifestyle problems and lifestyle issues. And that's how you get that bigger holistic piece. When we're focusing solely on abstinence, we're looking towards the more serious or severe end of substance use disorder. People will say, well, I don't believe in that. It doesn't matter what you believe in. The science tells us that these things work. And so shame on us if we're not willing to expand our understanding, because everybody's not at the table. Solo or natural recovery involves the use of one's intrapersonal and interpersonal resources, right? What that looks like, I remember when somebody said they got up one morning and they decided they were going to stop using. I'm like, you're not telling the truth. Or I went to this place where you're just really dry. Anybody ever, you're just a dry drunk or whatever we say. They really did that. Treatment-assisted recovery. Everybody doesn't go to formal treatment, but some people do. Then we've got our peer-assisted recovery, involves the use of structured recovery mutual aid groups to initiate and to maintain our recovery status. So again, there are folks who don't believe, and I was one of them many years ago, that didn't believe that people experience natural recovery. I got educated, and now I know that people can and do. And they need to be included in this recovery movement that's 20.5 million people. Frameworks of recovery, right? So we've got religious frameworks of recovery. These are people who, within their formal religious tradition, are able to seek, initiate, and maintain their recovery. It's not how they treat their illness, it's how they maintain their recovery. Difference? Y'all got the difference? Because most religions, I'm also a person who's a clergy person, most religions that I have known are not treatment providers, right? They're soul providers, not treatment providers. So the medical aspect that we're saying evidence-based isn't in a treatment, isn't in a religion. Doesn't mean that people who are religious don't have a role, right? Because especially in the Black and African American community, where people are going is to their church. That's where they're showing up. That's where we're showing up primarily for our initiation, where we're trying to learn, or our family members are trying to learn what on earth is going on with this person. And then where we return for ongoing recovery support services. So if we're not going there, as was shown to us earlier, then we're missing a lot of folks. If we don't have recovery centers or recovery community organizations in those places, we're not including those folks. And so we don't have a full and complete recovery organization that's going to move some of this forward. I like to call those recovery deserts, right? We talk about food deserts where there's grocery stores and other things that would require somebody to eat that aren't there. I call it recovery deserts when we don't have basic recovery support services or treatment centers for people in their community to be able to access. Spiritual frameworks, many of us know what those are. Grows out of a place called humility. It grows out of a place called, we're recognizing our brokenness, so we're wounded healers, if you will. Those are the frameworks that come out of that place. What we know is that religious and spiritual frameworks can closely exist. They can overlap, so people can go to all different kinds of ways to seek support. And then there's the next one, which is secular. And I call it kind of God or spirituality neutral, that it's not a requirement for membership. One of the things that we know is that people flow in and out of these different frameworks of recovery. You may start in one and switch to another. You may do many of them at the same time. If all of those aren't available, or if we don't know about all of those different things, and we're working in this field of treatment and or recovery support, we need to get educated. We need to improve our understanding of all of these. Recovery identity. This is a tricky one, right? So for some people, their identity is neutral, right? It doesn't matter. They've resolved the problem, but they don't identify themselves as alcoholics or addicts. There's another group of people who are called recovery positive. I would be a recovery positive person. My status of recovery from addiction is an important part of my personal identity. So I'm called recovery positive. And then there's this other group of people called recovery negative. And they don't share it with anyone. And they don't share it with anyone because of personal shame that's derived from this status. And I'm going to go through some of the research that was just described, especially for Black and brown people, because there's also recovery identity because of discrimination, right? And so that would be another reason that wasn't in the research that we looked at when we started doing some of this. And so thank you for your last presentation, because I don't think that people who are being discriminated against are in any of these places, right? It's not coming from personal shame. It's not safe for them to be recovery positive. And they're not really recovery neutral by choice, right? And isn't recovery about choice? Recovery relationships, this is another one that I find to be really interesting. And we see it in our recovery housing, we see it in sometimes, so it can be kind of double-edged, right? So people initiate and sustain their recovery without involvement of other people in recovery and without identification in a larger recovery community. We've also got folks who do it simultaneously. So they have people who are their friends, who are in the recovery community and in the recovery movement, as well as those in the civilian or larger, I used to call them street people. So I'm still working on a good title of how to refer to people who aren't in recovery. Right now, civilian is where I am. So they can kind of float back and forth or include a larger group of people in their recovery. Then there's another group of people in recovery who are almost completely sequestered or closed off, if you will, from anyone outside of the recovery community. So that is another type of relationship. And it's interesting because a lot of us think this notion of virtual recovery and those types of relationships, we think of them as new because of COVID, but they've been around for a really long time. Women are particularly attracted to virtual recovery relationships. And some of that is about when we're going to some of these meetings, because of our lived experience, we are not safe, right? And so it's a safer way to participate in some forms and types of recovery. This is, I think, one of the most difficult ones, is recovery terminology. So it looks at how someone identifies themselves. Are you in recovery? Have you recovered? Are you recovering? And these terms matter because if you're an insurance company and you hear that somebody is still recovering, what's the likelihood that you want to pay for those services, right? Because it means I'm going to have to pay forever and ever and ever and ever. And so again, it's tricky because we know that there's no cure. We know that that for some of us, it takes constant vigilance in order to maintain our abstinence. So sometimes I find that term is overemphasizes sobriety or abstinence and really isn't looking at the fuller picture of recovery. Recovered. How many people have heard that word and it's not one of your favorites? Yeah, thank you for your honesty. Thank you. It's a tough one because we have a particular, what we think in our heads recovered means. And so we don't like it. Some of us are frankly scared of it. We're scared to say we've recovered because we're going to use, it might mean we're going to use again because we've recovered. In particular literature of mutual support groups, because I do say that I have recovered, right? What I have recovered from is a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. And that belongs to a particular pathway of recovery. And so I'm okay with it. And if you look at the literature from that particular pathway of recovery, you will notice that the subtitle of the name of the book, and if you look at the little letters when you start in the book, which a lot of us don't start with, but if you look at the little Roman numerals, it says how thousands of men and women have recovered, past tense. Past tense. So if you look at the literature, it tells us that we have recovered. Also, when we introduce ourselves in general situations, right? And if I were to say, my name is Jan and I'm an addict, well, for some, that would mean they grab their pocketbooks and they stop listening because they have an image of what an addict is. For some, they don't know whether I'm using or not because I haven't told them. I've just told them that I have a problem. I haven't told them that I'm part of the solution when I say I'm an addict in public, right? There's a difference when you're in a mutual support meeting. We do, as the culture has established in those particular meetings when we're presenting or we're in community or we're in a general population, if we're not saying more than I'm clean or I'm an addict or something along those lines, particularly that I'm an addict or an alcoholic, nobody knows. And former, pretty old studies now, so I think it would be interesting for somebody to do a new one, but Faces and Voices of Recovery commissioned a study many years ago, and what they found was that people thought if somebody was recovering, they thought they were still using. And so they didn't think people got better. So they didn't really understand this language of I'm an alcoholic or I'm an addict, because in their minds, the majority, far great majority, thought that they were still using. It's an interesting thing because some of this research was done by colleagues and friends of mine, Bill White, Ernest Kurtz, and Mark Sanders, many, many years ago. And they called it a new recovery paradigm back then. So what we really have is another new recovery paradigm because we didn't get it right then. But it's time that we do, right? This new recovery paradigm that they described many, many years ago. It is time the recognition of multiple pathways and styles of recovery move beyond superficial rhetoric. We say it all the time, but do we do it in practice? It is time that the field aggressively pursued a recovery research agenda, which we're beginning to do, but we have a long way to go. And some of that wasn't even driven by us. That was driven by scientists' desire to know how it is that we do this thing. So we got to work better with them. And we have to drive that recovery research agenda. We have to go to people like Corey and John and some of the other ones and say, I want to know. Somebody asked that really good question earlier, right? I want to know. We want to know. We demand to know. And then they'll start doing it. But if we don't, they're going to continue, and rightly so, to research the things that are interesting to them. And we can be grateful that they're at the table with us in the first place, and that they invite us to the table. But we need to make the table, and we need to invite them to the table. We have it upside down. It's time that the recognition of multiple pathways and styles of recovery fully permeate the philosophies and clinical protocols of all organizations. One size doesn't fit all. And maybe I don't belong in the abstinence-based treatment center, but it doesn't mean that I don't get to benefit from treatment and quality evidence-based treatment. It might mean that I don't get to go to the recovery house where abstinence is expected, but it doesn't mean that I don't need to go somewhere. So we've got to have that full continuum, that full cascade of care and services and opportunities available for all of us. It's time we walk the talk. So some of the resources, it was mentioned earlier, Facing Addiction in America, the Surgeon General's report. If you haven't read it, it's a good one to read. If you don't want to read the big thick book, it's purple. Just pull out chapter 5 because it's specific to recovery. If you haven't been to the Recovery Research Institute and don't know the right terms, they have this really cool thing on there called a dictionary, right? And so you can go and look at some of the terms that people are using so that we can advance our language, especially when we are in the general public. There's Wellbriety, which is primarily grew out of the Native American community, and white bison. There's LifeRing Secular Recovery. So if you don't know about that one, hit that link and you can learn about it. For people who are LGBTQ, this is a wonderful source or resource, gayandsober.org. If you don't know it, learn it. It talks about some of the issues that are specific to the gay, lesbian community, and it also has a list of meetings that people would tend to go to. Smart recovery. A lot of us have gotten to that one, and then we stop, right? So we offer a 12-step group, or we pat ourselves on the back because we know about smart recovery. Or we know about recovery dharma, so we think we're pretty literate on what's out there. There's also Secular Organization for Sobriety. Many of us know AA and NA. How many of us have ever heard of lion tamers? Good, I stumped most people, all except for one. Faith-based recovery, lion tamers. Not my pathway, but a pathway that we need to know because it is a pathway for someone. BIPOC recovery dharma. Wow, we're drilling down, right? But people who don't feel welcome in other recovery dharma groups or in other mutual 12-step groups can go to the recovery dharma groups for Black, Indigenous people of color. In the Rooms is one of my favorite because it references different pathways and styles and frameworks and all of those things that I've talked about of recovery. And so that's a wonderful place to start. If you're providing treatment services, if you're providing recovery support services, you need to know about In the Rooms. The one is for folks who are Muslim, right? So there are groups out here that we need to know about, and we need to find ways to include the people of these different groups and not get into the weeds about, are you still using, or are you? We don't do that with other illnesses, right? I don't condemn my brothers and sisters who have cancer, who take medicine. But we do it to each other in this space of recovery. I don't condemn people who don't get well with other illnesses. I love them, and I have compassion for them. And I try to help them, and I be with them, and I listen to them, and those are the things that I do for people who have other illnesses who don't necessarily get well. But we don't do that often with this one. And so I think we need to ask ourselves, are we really willing to participate in this another new paradigm of recovery? Are we really willing to do that? Or do we have some work to do, which is equally okay if we're willing to commit to doing the work so that we can have a better understanding and that we can manage the bias that shows up for us? Because I still have bias. And I just said that in front of everybody and on the TV camera. But I do. I still have bias. But what's different about me and my bias today is that I have people that I can talk to, and I know it's really important for me to manage my bias. And it's really important for me to continue to become literate in some of the language. This is the first time in my life that I've had on my name tag, she, her, hers. I refused for a long time because I didn't understand how important it is to have this on my name tag. Today I can do that because I was leaving people out if I wasn't willing to put this on my name tag. I didn't get that. I get it now, and I'm willing to do it. I'm willing to be a part of the bigger solution, whereas before I really struggled with that. And the struggle was real. The struggle is real, and we need to know that too. Let's get it right, folks. We can do this. We can do this. So thank you.